Thank you very much. Welcome everybody, first of all, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present this work and these ideas here today. I'm very excited to be here and to speak about whether and how increasing self-knowledge may motivate positive trait change in the moral domain, meaning that we could maybe make people or increase people's stable tendency to behave in a moral way. And when I speak about moral behavior, what I'm referring to here is to all kinds of actions that are commonly considered to be the right thing to do. But these actions actually often involve individual costs, such as investing time or money. And actually our life presents a myriad of opportunities for us to behave in moral ways, for example, by volunteering for a good cause, by helping other people in need, being honest with others, cooperating with others, and also behaving in an environmentally friendly way. These are all examples of moral behavior I'm referring to here. And actually, it's quite striking that moral behavior contributes to the flourishing of society. For example, by increasing other people's welfare, by supporting well-functioning interpersonal relationships, and also actually by making our world a better place in the sense that we can actually protect our environment by these behaviors. And conversely, the social and societal costs of immoral behavior, they are tremendous. So for example, exploitation really causes poverty, economic growth is undermined by corruption and bribery. Also lying to someone, dishonesty, destroys interpersonal relationships, and pollution, of course, actually destroys our planet and thereby endangers mankind across the globe. So I think that we as scientists, and particularly this group of scientists who are interested in improving life, should actually be interested in how to promote moral behavior. And with this goal, we are, of course, not the first ones thinking about how to promote moral behavior. Actually, there is quite some research going on in the behavioral and social sciences for decades interested in promoting moral action. And this research actually focused on changing the situation. So this was the common approach, like changing, for example, the incentive structure, rewarding moral behavior and punishing immoral behavior. That is also something that is actually implemented in our public policy. More recently, softer approaches such as nudging are gaining increasing attention. So here I brought two examples of social norm nudging, where people receive information about other people's moral behavior, and the idea is that they will then also behave in a moral way. And overall, these situation-based approaches to promote moral action, they have their merits, and they also have been shown to be somehow effective in promoting moral behavior, but not generally so. So actually there is also quite some evidence showing that these approaches can backfire, meaning that once they are implemented, so pro-social or moral behavior is actually decreased. And one reason for this is that by providing extrinsic rewards or punishment, we actually crowd out people's intrinsic motivation to behave in a moral way. And also, by definition, these approaches, they target specific situations. So they are about to change people's behavior in a specific situation, and thereby they actually inhibit more consistent behavior change that can actually extend to other contexts, to other similar kinds of situations. So there is also, in line with this, some evidence, I think we can all agree on this, that behavior is not only a function of the situation, right? It's also a function of the persons acting in the situation. So if we simply focus on changing the situation to promote moral behavior, we actually miss out on this second piece of the puzzle. We focus on one piece, but we actually essentially neglect the other piece. And this is particularly striking because we now know from various research across fields that personality does account for individual variation in moral behaviors. So there are consistent links between personality and, for example, honest behavior, cooperative behavior, pro-social behavior, and pro-environmental behavior. So I was recently started to ask myself, why not bring the individual into focus when we think about promoting moral behavior? Meaning, why not try to change people's personality in a positive way so that we can actually make them sort of more moral, behave in a more moral way? Some of you may now think, well, that's a nice idea, but we know from research that personality is actually fixed and stable. So how could we ever change it? As Brian also mentioned in his talk today, and I'm sure we will hear about this more often during this conference, there is actually now increasing evidence that most people have a desire to change certain aspects of their personality, and more importantly, that they can actually change in line with these desires, and that we can help them change in line with these desires through tailored personality change interventions. I'm not going into detail with this because I'm sure Miriam Stieger will talk about this during this conference. So for now, just trust me that it is possible and that we do have sort of the methods available now to implement changes in line with people's desires. And so knowing this, we would now probably naturally ask, well, but do people want to become more moral? So do they have the desire to actually change and to become more moral persons? And this question was one question that we were interested and tried to answer with the research that I'm going to present now. And when I say we, I mean also Reinhard de Vries from the Free University in Amsterdam, with whom I conducted this research. So to answer this question, whether people have change goals in the moral domain, we use the HEXACO personality model. For those of you who are not familiar with this model, it's simply speaking a 6-factorial extension and variation of the Big Five. And most crucially, it adds a new 6th basic trait dimension called honesty, humility. The other 5 dimensions are roughly the same as in the Big Five, so there are also some differences, but the most critical difference is this new dimension, honesty, humility, which is defined as the tendency to be fair and genuine in dealing with others. And according to this, low trait levels on honesty, humility can be described by adjectives such as being sly, greedy, pretentious, boastful, and deceitful, whereas high levels on this trait dimension capture being sincere, honest, modest, fair-minded, and faithful. So as you can see here, honesty, humility seems to be the prime candidate to capture something like individual differences in moral character. So we thought, well, this model actually provides a nice basis to study change goals also in the moral domain. So how did we assess change goals? We basically provided participants with information about these 6 trait dimensions, and I here brought for exemplary reasons just the description for honesty, humility. And as you can see here, for example, we told people that individuals who score high on honesty, humility tend not to manipulate others for personal gain, and they are uninterested in wealth, social status, and so on and so forth. Whereas people who score low on honesty, humility, they usually put themselves first, they are attached to material things, and so on and so forth. And with this description of these traits, we then gave participants the following statement, which reads, if I could change myself, I would like to be on honesty, humility. And so they indicated whether they wanted to be lower or higher on this trait dimension, or neither lower nor higher, means basically stay the same on the 7-point scale that you can see here. So what did we find? Actually, what we did look at is, first of all, on the prevalence of change goals for these different trait dimensions. And we also wanted to learn more about how change goals, in the sense of increasing on a certain trait, how this relates to people's current trait levels. So here is a graph, and I want to draw your attention to this left set of bars here, which shows that the prevalence of change goals, which is here simply classified as having a change goal or not, just for simplicity, this prevalence of change goals was particularly low for honesty, humility, meaning that only a third of our participants actually reported goals to change on this dimension. As you can also see for all the other traits, the prevalence of change goals was higher. And also what was really striking is that people low and high on this trait dimension wanted to change in a similar way. So when we considered both change goals and trait levels in a continuous way, as we of course did in the main analysis, so here in the graph, it's just for simplicity that I categorized people according to their level in high and low. So we basically saw a zero correlation between their current trait levels and their change goals, meaning that irrespective of whether people were high or low on honesty, humility, they did not really want to change, whereas for most of the other traits, we saw that people who had less socially desirable trait levels, for example, being less conscientious, they wanted to actually become more conscientious as those who already had high levels. So this was kind of an interesting finding. And we also wanted to get a better understanding of the change goals on these dimensions. We also assessed people's satisfaction with their personality, with the idea that those people who might be more satisfied with how they are, so with their overall personality, they should be less inclined to change, and vice versa. And this was actually also something that we saw, but not for honesty, humility again. So irrespective of whether people had high or low levels on honesty, humility, they were actually similarly satisfied with their personality. For the other traits, we mostly saw that people who had more socially desirable levels also were more satisfied with their personality. So we asked ourselves, why is that? How can we explain that honesty, humility seems to stand out? And we came across the idea that maybe it's self-enhancement that can be a potential candidate. And self-enhancement is actually particularly prominent in the moral domain, meaning that people perceive themselves as moral, they perceive themselves as more moral than others, and they also perceive themselves as more moral than justified based on their actions, meaning they actually overestimate their trait morality. And this is quite a consistent finding that we also found in social psychology and in other research areas. And it nicely aligns also with the high importance people place on moral identity. So when you ask participants to rate different traits regarding how important they perceive themselves for their identity, you can see that most people will say that moral traits such as honesty, fairness, that these are crucial aspects of their identity. And this makes somehow sense. If people think of themselves as moral beings, and they also think that this is an important aspect of their identity, why would they want to change on this aspect, right? So we thought about how can we overcome this? And we thought maybe we actually have to make people aware of their self-enhancement. Maybe painful, but can also be effective in a way. So we tried to increase actually people's self-knowledge. And with self-knowledge, I mean like an accurate representation of people's own characteristics. So we wanted to give them a better feeling of their actual morality. There are indeed multiple ways to increase self-knowledge. So actually there are lots of self-help books that you can buy and that promise you to provide some insights into your personality that you don't know so far. But well, we thought that might not be the most scientific way that we could choose. So we actually decided to go with providing participants some personality feedback. So in our third study, what we basically did is we first of all assessed people's trait levels, again, using a self-report. And then 2 weeks later, we provided them with personality feedback using their previous reports. We used a between subjects design, so only one group received the personality feedback, And in this group, what we did, we provided people with their absolute trait scores, and we also provided them with information about their relative scores in relation to a representative Dutch sample. So we assessed the data in the Netherlands. That's why we used a representative Dutch sample here. So we basically told people, hey, you are very high relative to others. You're good, so to say, on honesty, humility relative to others. Or we told them, well, you're below average on this trait and also on the other 5 traits. In the no feedback condition, in turn, we asked people to self-evaluate their relative standing on these traits. So we basically asked people to estimate whether they score relatively low or average or relatively high compared to a representative sample. So they basically provided a self-assessment of their relative standing on these traits. And then after that, we used the same measure as in study 1 to actually measure people's change goals. So let's have a look at the results. First of all, the no feedback condition, which is basically a replication of study 1. And indeed, we also replicated the findings of study 1, meaning a relatively low prevalence of change goals for honesty, humility. And again, when we calculated the correlation between these change goals and individuals' trait levels, we essentially saw a null relation. So same results as before. More interestingly now is when we have a look at the feedback condition. So what happened after participants received personality feedback? And what you can see here is that actually the pattern for honesty, humility nicely aligns with all the other traits. So the prevalence of change goals increased quite heavily. It was double the size for particularly those people scoring low on honesty, humility. And so accordingly, we now also saw a substantial negative relation between individuals' change goals and their current trait levels. And this was comparable in size to the other traits. So apparently it seems that those individuals with a relatively low honesty, humility score, they reacted to the personality feedback by now also reporting goals to change on this trait in a socially desirable, meaning a positive way. So does that imply limited self-knowledge about people's moral character? Probably yes. And this was also mirrored in some other findings that we observed in this third study. Namely, what we also saw is that in the no feedback condition, participants rated themselves clearly above average in honesty, humility. And this was much less so on the remaining dimensions. So they actually thought that they scored quite well relative to others and actually more so than on the other traits. What we also saw is in the no feedback condition, a very low convergence between people's relative self-assessment and the self-reports on honesty, humility. So these two variables only correlated to 0.16 for honesty, humility, but it showed a much higher correlation for all the other traits. And finally, participants were actually most negatively surprised about their honesty, humility levels in the feedback condition as compared to all the other traits. So it seems they don't really have a good feeling about their relative trait levels in honesty, humility. And once we tell them, well, it's actually a bit painful for them. So to conclude, it seems that usually people do not want to become more moral. And this is, by the way, also a finding that Jesse Sun and Jeffrey Goodwin found. It was actually published a bit before us, but we only learned about it when we had started that research. But it's super nice to see that they also found that people do not want to change for the better on different kinds of moral traits. And our findings suggest that this is arguably due to individuals' tendency to morally self-enhance, to see themselves as more moral than they actually are. Luckily, this can be tackled through increasing self-knowledge, as our findings imply, so we can actually help people understand and understand their self-enhancement in the moral domain and increase their self-knowledge. And I think that this actually offers a huge potential for actually personality change and thereby for promoting moral behavior in a sustainable way. And this is because if we can motivate people to become more moral, if we can instill desires to change for the better in the moral domain, we can use tailored personality change interventions to actually realize that change. And by definition, since personality expresses across contexts, we should thereby also promote moral behavior in a much more sustainable way as we are able using situation-based approaches. So my plea for today is that it's actually time for change, also when we think about moral character and about how to promote moral behavior. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the talk, Isabel. It was really great to see that we can help people to change.
Thank you.